Morning, everybody. It's Sunday, and to my Greek brothers and sisters, Christos Anesti, it's Greek Easter, so Christ is risen. Today, what we're going to be doing is we're going to be flying through the book of First Peter, and that we'll be tackling 3 small verses in this section of chapter 2, which has been a discussion about, Peter's been talking about submitting to all human authority. Okay, so what I want to do is read First Peter chapter 2, the little passage we have from First Peter, which I brilliantly didn't pull up in time. Okay, here we go. And our passage is going to be verse 21 to 23 of First Peter chapter 2. Okay, and I'll read it for you right now. It says, actually, I should read from verse 18. Okay. Slaves, in reverent fear of God, submit yourselves to your masters, not only to those who are good and considerate, but to those who are harsh. For it is commendable if someone bears up under pain of unjust suffering, because they are conscious of God. But how is it to your credit if you receive a beating for doing wrong and you endure it? If you suffer for doing good and you endure it, this is commendable before God. To this you were called, because Christ suffered for you, leaving you an example that you should follow in his steps. He committed no sin, and no deceit was found in his mouth. When they hurled insults at him, he did not retaliate. When he suffered, he made no threats. Instead, he entrusted himself to him who judges justly. Okay, so those last 3 verses are what we're going to be talking about today. Before I start, I got a little shout out to my great nephew Themio, 3 years old, and apparently he watches some of these sermons. So I wanted to just take a second and say, hey Themio, stand tall, mister, and stay out of trouble, okay? Love you. That part, sort of stay out of trouble is what we're talking about in this section of First Peter, right? And of course, it's so much more than just a behave yourself kind of passage, right? Because those are really, really boring. They're not in the Bible, just behave yourself. Because like I said, they are boring, and God is many things, but he's certainly not boring, right? And we'll look at this passage and talk about what Peter's getting at. Peter is not telling us in this chapter to be moral, okay? Or to obey the golden rule or something like that. He's encouraging us to be holy, right? Now, but you're going to say, wait, aren't morality and holiness the same thing? And of course, not at all, right? Not at all. They're like night and day from each other, as a matter of fact. Anyone can be moral, right? And have no character at all, no good character. In fact, they can hit you over the head with their morality and really give you a lecture and still be truly despicable characters, right? And we see this sometimes in things like stars in Hollywood or politicians who love to preach to you about things, and yet they do it not out of love, but it seems they do it with a heart full of anger, and often hatred for their opponents. You can't do that with holiness, right? Because holiness, the behavior that comes from holiness, right, comes from character. Okay, holiness is being true, being faithful, compassionate, loving without shade, without excuses, and without change, right? That's what holiness is. So holiness is in your heart and in your mind before you even start behaving, right? And that's what I mean when I said character before, right? As opposed to just being moral. Anyone can be moral. To be holy, it's something that is inside your heart and your mind, right? It's before you act, it's who you are, right? It's your being. It's not activity-based necessarily. It's your being. Now, why do you want to be holy, right? What's the purpose? We want to be holy because God is perfectly holy, right? And he calls us to be holy so that we can do what? We can enjoy life with him, right? And enjoy our lives in general, right? Because we're not meant to be living in sin, in futility and destruction, right? God made us to be holy so that we can enjoy him and we can live the way he wanted us to, right? In the family of the Trinity, there's perfect joy, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. And then Peter has been saying in chapter 1, you're called to be part of that family, right? By adoption, when Christ saves us. So you remember those bulletins we used to get when we actually attended the church in person, right? It always said at the bottom, there's a little passage from the Westminster Catechism, and it said, what is the chief end of man? And that is to glorify God and to enjoy him forever, right? Enjoy forever. That's the part I really like. And with the chief end of humanity is to glorify God and enjoy him forever. And that's what we're going to be talking about today, right? We're going to be talking about how we can glorify God in the circumstances that we just read from chapter 2, verses 18 on, where it talked about, I mean, George covered it last week, but the idea of facing people who treat us unjustly, you know, not just that we've done something. What about when we've done something right and people treat you unjustly? How are you going to handle that, right? How are you going to behave? And what I want to put in people's minds as we go on, because I'm going to be referring to it, is that behavior comes from character, right? It becomes from who you are. And your character, or your inner heart and your inner mind, right, for the believer, is produced and framed by your love of holiness, right? How much you love holiness is going to impact your character, and that is what is going to cause your behavior, right? So holiness, so we're going to talk about behavior coming from character, right? Character coming from holiness, and holiness always has a purpose, right? And the purpose of holiness is to glorify God, right? He's very worthy of being glorified. You know, God doesn't need you to glorify him. It's not an ego thing. It's that it's true, and he's true. And when we glorify him, it's our way of saying, I love you. And it's our way of living our lives the way they're meant to be, right? So your focus and everything is on the goodness and trueness and holiness of God. So we're not going to do this perfectly, but we're not going to say that we have to be perfect, but we want to say that that is going to be our goal, right? There's always a goal in mind, right? To be that way. In last week's sermon, right, George he did a great job, by the way, explaining the world of slavery in ancient Rome and how the Christian slave should bear up under those conditions, right? And it was specifically talking about in front of an unbelieving world, your behavior in front of an unbelieving world. That's the focus here, and even in the section we're looking at today. Next, when we get to chapter 3, it's going to talk about our behavior with other Christians, right? And in our lives, our daily lives. So it's all being covered. He said that they needed to submit, not just to good masters, but to bad masters, right? I dare say that would take some character, wouldn't it? But it's not a case of just do this because I told you so. Okay, it's because by showing our character of holiness under very difficult circumstances, what are we doing? We're honoring our real master, right? By showing him that we're submitting to his will, not the will of the person here, right? Even though it's a proxy, right? So we're submitting to his will and to the circumstances he put us in, rather than letting the circumstances rule over us and change us, right? And deflect us from our relationship with him. So, you know, we're facing trials, and our answer is often to fight back using worldly principles, right? And when we do that, what are we doing? We're saying that we love the world more than we love God, right? That's why we're struggling and striving to make sure we get our justice from the people who are persecuting us, right? Because we're putting our hopes and our trusts in here, not with God. And that really is what it comes down to. Now, when we hear this kind of thing, we immediately apply it to situations in our life, and we say, well, that's all, you know, fine, but you don't know so-and-so, or you don't know my circumstance. And nobody's saying it's not important, you know, but you're saying that, well, you don't know my mother or my boss or these other people, they make my life so difficult. And you're absolutely right. Peter didn't know any of those people, right? But he's never going to say during this passage or any other place, you get a pass because your circumstances are difficult. Okay? And that's not something you hear often these days. Peter does understand how hard these things are, right? Especially since he started following Christ, because he had to face them again and again and again. Just go through the book of Acts and see all the stuff that happened to Peter, okay? How badly he was treated for doing good. And you'll see he's not writing this like, you know, he's somewhere far away and he's not connected to you. You know, he's gonna, in a sense, he's gonna say, nobody is gonna get off the hook because of their circumstance and be able to claim, I retaliated, I got back in anger, or I said this and that because my circumstances were so tough. No way. You know, Peter's not going to go for that. Why? Is it because he's cold or uncaring, right? Or because he's telling you just deal with it? Not at all, right? That's not something you're going to see in the scriptures, right? So what is Peter doing this for? He's trying to tell you this because he's got something so much better in mind for you, right? There's retaliation, and then there's what Peter's been talking here, which is God's way. And he's going to say, this is so much better, even though it doesn't seem like that. And I mean, it's not a newsflash to say, we understand God is not against us. You know, we face difficult circumstances. We know he's for us in those circumstances, right? What you think is best is not good enough. But God's best is, even though we don't see it as the best at the time, right? So we got to remember also the whole book is talking about the idea that we're exiles in this world, right? It's not our home. It's not where our heart is. It's not where we seek our identity or our approval or our ultimate value, right? And you feel devalued when someone gives you a hard time, especially if you're doing something that is good. You know, it's natural to feel that way. But then again, I mean, how many times have you heard someone tell a story like, you know, they were in a store and the clerk said something or they made a mistake and they just like, you know, told them off in some really clever fashion. And, you know, those stories just happen every day, you hear them. You know, or you have other stories with people who think they're a little more righteous. And it's like, I saw a person being rude to a clerk, so I gave them this and I told them that and I humiliated them in front of other people. One thing you don't hear is a story about how someone was, you know, was treated badly and yet they remained gracious and answered very graciously. Okay, unless they're trying to tell you the story of what a great person they are. But usually those stories don't float around. Right? It's the stories that people want to hear are the great comebacks, the great crushing of the rivals. And that's not for us, right? So, like, what about you and me, right? Are we complainers? Are we fighting for our pride at all costs? You know, are we demanding our rights in all circumstances? What about when you're trying to show character, but it's very hard and we're being crushed by people? You know, it's very, very difficult for us. You know, in some ways, it's just our pride. In some ways, we feel really discouraged by these things. One of the reasons is we're not good at submission, right? We're not good at taking a hit under any circumstances. It's very, very hard to face the truth and go along with Peter on this, right? And he's going to need a really convincing argument that's going to convince us that the best way to go when somebody's wronging us is to do it God's way. Right? And think about it. You know, it's not something that comes naturally or easily to turn somebody's anger against you into something else rather than just giving it back. Right? So what's Peter going to do for a great argument? Well, he's going to lower the ultimate boom in verse 21. He's going to give you the inescapable argument, or at least for the Christian, the inescapable argument, right? He's going to be like a parent talking to a willful child and saying, you know, your beloved and deceased grandmother wouldn't have wanted you to behave that way. And you're like, oh, don't bring in grandma. Well, Peter's going to do much, much more than that. He's going to use the ultimate example, right? That's going to, at the same time, tear at your heartstrings as sharpen your mind, right? And he's going to use Christ as our example. Okay, look at what he quotes in these little passages. Three little verses. They're so action-packed and they're so beautiful, right? What does it say in verse 21? To this you were called, because Christ suffered for you, leaving you an example that you should follow in his steps. Okay, so right off, what do we see? Christ is our standard, right? He's the model for us in all situations. How did Christ suffer? Let's just look at just a few passages here, and maybe this will bring to mind some of the details. In Luke 22, during right before the crucifixion, it says, the men who were guarding Jesus began mocking and beating him. They blindfolded him and demanded, prophesy, who hit you? And they said many other insulting things to him. Okay, so imagine Jesus, he's blindfolded, he can't see what's going on. These guys are just taking swings at him and hitting him and saying, oh, which one of us hit you? I don't want to be those guys on Judgment Day. My hope is that they were all turned to him in the end. They all changed their ways. But think of mocking Jesus, who was so good, and these guys just took advantage of him. They tried to make a fool out of him. Look at Matthew 27. It says, this is the same kind of thing during that time. Then the soldiers of the governor took Jesus into the common hall and gathered unto him a whole band of soldiers. And they stripped him, and they put on him a scarlet robe. And when they had made a crown of thorns, they put it on his head, and a reed in his hand. And they bowed the knee before him and mocked him, saying, Hail, King of the Jews. And they spit on him and took the reed and struck him on the head. And after that, after they had mocked him, they took off the robe from him and put his own raiment on and led him away to be crucified. We have not had to face that, thank God. But it does kind of take the steam out of our, yeah, but you don't understand what I'm dealing with. And Peter's doing it on purpose, right? It's he really is. And I'll tell you something. I know people struggle with this. I struggle with this. And I'll tell you, even while I was writing this sermon this week, an incident came up where I completely failed to follow this thing that Peter was asking us to do. And that's a true story. It wasn't in front of unbelievers, actually, but still, it was a failure on my part in a very similar circumstance, right? So what did that passage we just read there tell us? It told us that Jesus suffered. But a lot of people have suffered and been humiliated in life, right? That's not why Christ is our example here. In verse 21, it says, to this you were called. Were you called just to suffer? No, never. There's never, ever, ever a place in the Bible where it's going to say suffering is an end just to itself. You just suffer. Not at all, right? There's always a purpose. And what we're going to learn here from this passage, what Peter's trying to tell us is Christ is our example, not in the fact that he suffered, but in how he suffered, right? In verse 22, it says, he committed no sin and no deceit was found in his mouth. That's a quote from Isaiah, right? The messianic passages. And what does it tell us? Christ was completely holy. Imagine Peter, who spent every single day with Christ for 3 years, standing up and saying, this man never committed a sin. He never said or did anything wrong. That's unique in the history of humanity for an eyewitness to say such a thing. It's one thing to say about someone who died 400 years before, oh, he was sinless. It's not the same, right? What do we know about Christ in this? None of his suffering came from what he deserved. Right? All the charges against him were lies, meant to keep power for people who were already in power, right? And regardless of the fact that they knew he was innocent. And that's another one. You remember Pilate? He's trying to let Jesus off. He's saying, oh, do this, do that. Don't crucify him. Don't get involved with this. But when the Pharisees finally, threatened him that they were going to rat on him to the emperor, what did he do? He just put Jesus right into the way and put him under the bus and railroaded him. So when it came down to it, it was about them, not about Christ. In verse 23, it says, When they hurled their insults at him, he did not retaliate. When he suffered, he made no threats. Right? So you have, he committed no sin and no deceit was found in his mouth. And when they hurled their insults at him, he did not retaliate. When he suffered, he made no threats. I want you to imagine Jesus for a second here. He made the people who were persecuting him. Think about that. How hard would it have been for him to unmake them? Right? He was mocked by King Herod. He was mocked by Pilate. He was mocked by the guards. He was mocked by the crowd. And, you know, in a way, one more person mocked him was Peter. Right? When they all said, oh, you're with this Galilean. No, I never knew this guy. Who's this guy? I don't know him. You know, and he even did that before, when Christ had seen him. You know, one of the reasons why he wept. You know, in front of Christ, he denied him. It's unbelievable. Though that night, what they did to Christ, you know, the things he had to face, his friends fleeing, all these different things, and he was innocent, and his purposes were completely good and completely holy. A completely good and true and honest and wonderful man they all knew. You know, the whole world turned against him. Now, maybe we're going to say, well, you know, Jesus is perfect and nothing affects him anyway, so it's not a big deal. That's a really bad way of looking at this. Okay, if your view of Christ is really that, well, he has no feelings. He was like solid steel, so all this stuff just bounced off him. Nothing could be further from the truth. And I think that shows a lack of understanding about Christ on earth. And finding out about this is going to fill your soul with joy, right? So if you're thinking that, take some time and look into it, and you'll see things are quite different. You remember it at Lazarus's death in John chapter 11, the famous verse, Jesus wept, right? But look at the verses before it, what it says. You know, when Jesus saw her weeping, that's Mary, and the Jews who had come along with her also weeping, he was deeply moved in his spirit and troubled. Okay, what about when his time in the Garden of Gethsemane? You know, when he had the fear and this you know, what was about to happen to him after, and look what did happen to him, right? So it's not that Jesus, oh, I don't retaliate because I don't care, it's not important, right? Jesus chose not to retaliate, okay? He is God on earth, and he is fully human also, right? But he chooses. Why did Jesus choose to submit to all this? Well, the answer is actually in verse 23 as well. Right? Let's look on a little bit, where it says, when they hurled their insults at him, he did not retaliate. When he suffered, he made no threats. Instead, he entrusted himself to him who judges justly. I'm going to ask this question: what did Jesus care about the judgment of sinners on him? Right? Don't judges on earth, I mean, from actual judges to just people we deal with, and ourselves included, don't we always get things wrong? Isn't our judgment always tainted by something? You know, by prejudice, by our own desires, by our own needs, right? We get unjustly judged when we do right, simply because our judges are unjust. Right? Why do we fight to gain justice from them? You know, if a person wrongs you and you think, I got to make this right somehow, right? How can you? And even if you do, so what? Whose approval are you getting in this? You know, think of how the judges Jesus faced. He looked at them and he said, is this where I'm getting my right and wrong from? Is this where I'm getting my value from? Not at all, right? But we're fighting to gain justice from the people who are persecuting us. Jesus knew all about the injustice he faced, and he knew it was noise, right? It was just this, all the talk they were saying about him. Why? Because he entrusted himself to the one judge, okay? It says he entrusted himself to the one who judges justly, right? There's one judge in the entire universe who is completely just. And he judges every single situation that has ever occurred, all of our situations in our lives, okay? Jesus's Father was seeing his actions and he was judging his case justly. Right? Jesus faced these things, right? Knowing God was watching. God sees the evidence, right? He knows when we do wrong and he knows when we do right and we suffer for it. And he takes our case, right? Isn't God wronged by us every single day, right? And the rest of humanity, every day we're wronging God and not giving him his just deserts. We're not giving him the glory that he has, if anything else, certainly earned from us for all the good, right? But he's long suffering. He doesn't lash out uncontrollably because he's holy, right? So we got to think about this the next time we get into a situation where we're wronged by somebody, that God is watching, right? Jesus entrusted himself to the one who judges justly. He knew that was his judge. That was the person who counted in this case. And that is reflected in how he behaved under these circumstances, right? So that when we know that God is watching, right? He's saying to you, don't retaliate, right? I'll retaliate. I will bring justice. Don't you trust me? Right? And we have a hard time doing that. We're saying, Lord, you're not bringing justice fast enough because now my pride is hurt. You know, it's like, no. Or maybe you're saying, this guy's treating me badly and I'm actually losing. I might lose my job because this person is treating me unjustly. Is God looking and saying, well, there's nothing I can do about that? Or it's not important? Not at all, right? He's going to judge everything justly, right? And when we trust him, we trust in what? We trust in his holiness, is the true holiness that never stands by and allows an injustice without making things right. Isn't that what God is doing? And isn't that a sign of his holiness? There's never going to be an injustice that's not going to be righted by God. Right? So, you know, we're standing by in these hard times. We can remember this and we can look to God and say, Lord, you judge my case, no matter what happens. That's our hope, right? We're asked to submit to all human authority. And in doing that, what are we doing? We're actually submitting to God, right? Christ submitted to human authority. He allowed himself to be tried. He allowed himself to be dragged through these ridiculous courts, you know? And why? Because he was submitting himself to the will of his Father. So how is Christ our example, right? He did a really, really good job, didn't he? Dealing with how people ill-used him. And if it was just a case that, well, Jesus is a steel statue, then we learn nothing. Right? We learn absolutely nothing because he's not an example we can follow in that case. Right? But, you know, remember in Hebrews chapter 2 and chapter 4, Jesus was made like us for a reason, so that we know he knows what we've been through and he's been through it himself. Right? We can follow him as our example. That's what examples are for. They're meant to be followed, you know? So his behavior, as we saw, was the result of what? It was a result of his character. And what was his character informed by? Right? His character was informed and framed by his holiness and his love of holiness because the love of his Father. Right? Holiness has a purpose, right? Which is to glorify God. When we act, we don't do good because it's good to be good to the good, right? God has said, you know what? I am good. Be like me. That's what I want you to do. That's going to be the ultimate blessing for you and everybody around you. Not your idea of good behavior, his idea of good, because it produces something much bigger than what we can produce, right? So his holiness had a purpose also in this case, right? He's glorifying God. He brought about, through his sufferings, he brought about the salvation of humanity, right? Of all those who believe. Through his suffering, his death, and his resurrection. There's one other little thing I want to talk about, though, is that by submitting to suffering innocently in those circumstances we talked about in his life, what was the effect on people around him? You remember the guards that were sent during the time he was in Jerusalem in the last few days? They sent guards to arrest him at one point. They came back and they hadn't arrested him. And they asked, the religious leaders asked them, why didn't you do it? And he said, they said, I've never seen anyone like this before. I've never heard anyone speak the way he speaks. You know, the impact of Jesus on them. But look at it after all those horrible things were done to him at the crucifixion. Look at Luke 23. Okay, now Jesus has now died on the cross. And it says, the centurion, seeing what had happened, praised God and said, surely this was a righteous man. Now, maybe you haven't thought of this one in a while. When all people who had gathered to witness this sight saw what took place, they beat their breasts and went away. Now remember, people go to executions often because it's a big party, right? They're pointing at guys, ha, 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 and they were certainly doing it to Jesus and to the thieves, right? Oh, save yourself. You saved others, now save yourself, ha, 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 ha. But they saw Christ on the cross and how he behaved, right? They saw what he was like facing all this wrong that people had done to him. What was the effect? They repented, you know? They were sad that this had taken place. They went away beating their breast. That's a sign of repentance. You know, it's, I have done wrong by wanting this man to be crucified. I have done wrong by treating him badly. You know? And it says after that in the same passage, but all those who knew him, including the women who had been following him from Galilee, stood at a distance watching these things. What did his followers see? They saw Christ not dying in weakness, but in dignity and strength. Right? You might think, oh, if people treat me bad, I'm a sucker. Wrong. It's the sucker who gives in, and we all know it down deep. The one who gives in and just gives back what they get. The dignity and strength of Christ is our example in suffering, right? You saw the effect on the crowds. You know, these people who were his followers and were watching, they weren't perfect. They didn't even perfectly understand Jesus, but think of them watching the demeanor of Christ, forgiving his enemies from the cross. You know, it's just unbelievable. Forgiving the thief, you know, right beside him on the cross, telling him, you're going to be with me in paradise. People saw that and it changed them. Okay. So think about Christianity, how it developed. You know, Peter said this stuff. They were not perfect, the early Christians, but, you know, nobody picked up a sword in revolt against Rome. There were no Christian revolts. There have been revolts of all kinds in history, but there were no Christian revolts. You know, when you hear these stories of, oh, the soldiers of the cross carrying the cross and fighting these battles against these guys over here and over there, that was like 400 years after Christ, when Christianity had become so enmeshed with the state that now the aims of the state were, oh, these are Christian aims. That's baloney. There's never been a Christian state, and there's never ever gonna be a Christian state. Okay, those two things are mutually exclusive. One is the kingdom of Adam, one is the kingdom of Christ. Okay, and in the kingdom of Christ, what are we supposed to do? We're supposed to be like Christ. When he was humiliated, he didn't retaliate. If anybody on earth could, it was him, but he didn't, out of love. So Peter's not asking you to do something that you hate because it's the moral thing to do. That would be the most awful thing of all. If it's like, you know what, you need to be moral, so just do this thing. That's so bad. You know, and that's what we're teaching our kids in many cases, in schools and things like that. What a waste of time. You know, it doesn't work. It doesn't go anywhere. He's asking you to transform your character to be like Christ, right? Your behavior comes from your transformed character, which is built on the love of holiness and framed on the idea of holiness, on true beauty, justice, compassion. All those things are what are supposed to fill your heart, change your character, transform you, like it says in Romans, and then you behave, right? In a particular way. When we do that, what are we doing? We're saying, Christ, come in my heart and change me. And what does he do? Like it says in so many places in the Gospels, is this idea that there's going to be a harvest in your soul, right? It's going to produce something beautiful, and not just a little, a lot of beauty. Tons of beauty are produced by these things. Instead, if you want to retaliate, and if I want to retaliate, what are we doing? We're just growing more bitter weeds, right? And we're just behaving exactly by the world's methods, right? And we're attacking the people we've been wronged. And where does it lead? Nowhere. For the Christian, nowhere. As our characters start to change towards holiness and the purpose of holiness, we're no longer just going to react and be lashing out or being discouraged, right? We're going to start seeing things before they happen. We're going to be ready for those circumstances because our hearts are already ready for them. We've changed and we're changing ourselves. Right? So we don't want to retaliate or get even. We want to be like Christ. He loves his enemies. Right? He seeks the good of those who persecute him. Remember that? You know, Matthew chapter 5, 6. We have to let God be the one who's going to judge our case. You know, and he knows how hard that is for us. And he knows that it's really something that we have to get extra strength to do. Right? He knows that. He faced it in ways we can't imagine. Right? What a blessing we would have if we could do that, if we could have Christ's mind in suffering. Right? That yes, we're being wronged. We're not going to make excuses for other people when they're doing those things for us. But we're going to turn that situation into something beautiful by looking at something beautiful, right? Which is the holy character of God. And maybe through doing that, we're going to change the hearts of people around us, right? And that's what it says finds favor with God. Thank you very much. God bless you.